Good morning, Highlands, Presbyterian. So today we press on in our Lenten study of prayers in the Old Testament, what they teach us about God, what they teach us about ourselves. Today we're talking about fear. Plenty of people know arachnophobia, the fear of spiders. I'm not terrified of them, but I've also never seen the movie of the same name. I don't like spiders enough that I'd like to keep it that way. Lots of people experience glossophobia, the fear of speaking in public. They say that that fear is greater than the fear of death, meaning that more people would rather be in the coffin than standing next to it speaking at a funeral. My kids experience tonotrophobia, the fear of thunder. Coulrophobia is the fear of clowns. Dentophobia, the fear of dentists. I also found medical terms for the fear of peanut butter, plants, and gravity. The list I was perusing included phobophobia, the fear of phobias, at which point I realized things have gone too far. But fear is real. Impacts all of us differently. When Rachel and I were first married, I was perhaps not as supportive as a husband as I should have been when she expressed her fear of spiders, mostly because I was certain there were people breaking into the house the way that she screamed every time that she saw one. I like to think I'm more understanding now. I'm sure there are things I'm afraid of that she can't relate to. It's almost impossible to understand someone's fear unless you experience the same thing. Our minds can be so powerful. When we're afraid of something, we get stuck. We can't move until that thing is resolved. Plenty of people are willing to tell you to get over something. But until it passes, you're unlikely to be at ease. It will impact everything else that you do. And I think that's why we see it so often in politics and the news, because it captures our attention. We can't shut it off. And so people use that. I think politicians use that. I think the media uses that to capture our attention. And I think it's working. And the question is, how do we get out of that fear loop? I can't help but think about Howard Hughes, brilliant scientist, inventor, one of America's richest men, and yet his fear of germs, his fear of contamination led him to a place where he would wear Kleenex boxes for shoes so that his feet wouldn't touch the ground, and he wouldn't leave his hotel room for months. When they asked him to vacate his suite at the Desert Inn, rather than leave the hotel, he simply bought it. Right? And so I hope you never have to deal with anything that extreme, but fear is very powerful. Once it burrows into our minds and into our hearts, it's so easy for it to take control. And so keeping that in mind, we're going to look at King Hezekiah here in 2 Kings. For context, King Hezekiah is from 715 to 686 BC. His father Ahaz has died. Land is beset with challenges. Not only are the people drifting from God, but the Assyrian Empire is also looming nearby. The Assyrians under King Sennacherib were one of the most powerful forces in the ancient world. Army would have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers drawn from across their empire, and they were known for being terrifying. They weren't afraid to destroy cities, to port large populations. And so Hezekiah is leading a kingdom that is torn apart internally with strife, facing an external kingdom that could easily conquer the people. So we'd agree that Hezekiah has plenty to be afraid of. Perhaps we'd be sympathetic if he blamed God for putting him in this place. Maybe we'd even understand if Hezekiah turned to an idol in the hopes of getting a different or better response to his prayers. But Hezekiah did not allow his fear to control him. He saw the threats, but his reputation is for leading a time of spiritual reform. He's known for faithfulness in the face of adversity and his trust in divine deliverance. In the year 701, the Assyrian army is surrounded. They're ready to destroy the nation. And that's where we are here in chapter 19. And Assyria sends a messenger to taunt Hezekiah, warning him not to let his trust in God deceive him, for the destruction of Jerusalem is assured due to Assyria's power. Hezekiah is reminded by the messenger the gods of other nations did not deliver them from Assyria's army, so Hezekiah is a fool to believe that his God will deliver him differently. And so today we read Hezekiah's prayer in the midst of a dire situation. Every reason to fear, every reason to doubt God, and yet listen to the prayer. It doesn't sound like there's even a seed of doubt in it. O Lord, enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. The circumstances in which he finds himself do not impact his view of God's majesty. We talked a few weeks about Hannah's prayer, about rooting prayer and adoration of God's majesty, but here's a reminder not to let our surroundings and our circumstances change how we view God's majesty. It's an easy thing to do. We think we know how things ought to go, and when they don't, then rather than assume that we don't have the full picture, we assume God is asleep on the job. This is what Mary does when Lazarus dies and Jesus shows up. She says, if you had been here, Jesus, then my brother wouldn't have died, and says it in a spirit of accusation. She believes that she understands how things ought to have gone, and when God didn't shape them that way, God is the one who got things wrong, not her. Hezekiah doesn't take this step, despite the fact that he's surrounded by enemies, and his kingdom seems to be tearing itself apart on the inside. He is completely certain God is the creator and Lord of heaven and earth. He is certain that despite what he sees, despite the evidence of the world around him, that God is still in control. His doubt does not waver. And then he's not shy about asking for salvation. In verse 19, he says, so now, O Lord our God, save us, please, from his hand. Just before this, Hezekiah notes, the Assyrians have laid waste to nations. They've cast their gods into the fire. He knows that salvation can only come from outside of himself. The people will not be able to save themselves. And he is also perhaps pointing out to God that if the Israelites fall, perhaps God, people will assume that their God is just like other gods. That's how things worked in those days. People assumed the conquering nation had stronger gods. So like Hezekiah, don't be afraid to pray for big things. Don't be afraid to ask for big miracles. There's no way the Israelites could defeat the Assyrians on their own, but Hezekiah wasn't afraid to go to God in prayer and ask for deliverance. It was all he had. What happens after this? Glad you asked. The angel of the Lord struck down a huge number of the Assyrian army. The army turned tail and ran. And eventually Sennacherib ends up getting killed at home. Hezekiah prayed a bold prayer in the midst of his enemies, and he was delivered. And there's one other thing to note about his prayer. When Hezekiah prayed for deliverance, there's a second part of verse 19. He prayed so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, O Lord, are God alone. Hezekiah is praying with this missionary heart. He wants to be saved, and he knows that if the people are delivered, all the other nations of the world will want to learn more about the God who delivered the people from such a mighty army. Hezekiah isn't just thinking about himself. He's thinking about all these other people who don't know God, but might learn about God through such a miraculous event. Maybe we can learn to pray in the same way. When we ask for big things, especially in the midst of our enemies, when we're praying for God to shine a light in the midst of our darkness, may we remember that such a light can not only lead us out, but also lead others out of their own darkness. Our lives aren't simply meant for ourselves. They can serve as an example to others, just like when Jesus raised Lazarus. That was meant so that others might see it. When Mary asked Jesus and says, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died, Jesus is explicit about this is an opportunity to display the glory of God. In our reading from Corinthians, we're talking about how Paul was delivered out of Damascus, through a basket that was let down through a hole in the wall. He was surrounded by enemies. God delivered him. And why? So Paul could continue telling the story. So Paul could continue helping Christ's church grow. So when we pray in the midst of our fear, remember that God is a missionary God. God will deliver us and do so with a purpose so that we have a story to tell. When we overcome fear, when we emerge from the midst of our enemies, it serves a dual purpose. It delivers us and then sends us back into the world where we can share this good news with others, telling them a story about a God who delivers, about a God who overcomes. about a God who listens to our prayers. Because that's an incredibly powerful thing that overcomes fear, is when somebody else can come sit beside you and say, I had the same fear. And they can tell you the story of how they overcame it. And that can help lead you out. And so may we do the same thing. May we trust in God. In the midst of our fears, may we focus on how God is sovereign. And may we remember that God has given us a purpose and trust God to lead us out of that, to deliver us from that, not for our own purpose, but for God's purpose of growing Christ's church. May we remember God's heart for the world, and may that give us confidence to trust in God. May we remember that others share the same trials, the same fears. So when we pray, may we find a way for others to see the hope that bears us up.